All right, good morning. My name is Scott McMahon. I'm senior lobbyist with Flaherty and Hood. I represent the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities on a number of economic development issues at the Capitol. I also serve as the executive director for the Greater Minnesota Partnership. The GMNP is a partner organization to the coalition that works on specifically on economic development issues. And we bring together local governments, businesses, chambers of commerce, nonprofits, all of the stakeholders that care about economic prosperity in Greater Minnesota, and how we make sure that we have the alignment between our workforce and our job growth and our community needs. I'm excited to have you all join us today to talk about an issue that has become truly critical in Greater Minnesota over the past few years, and that's the childcare shortage that we have. Back, a year ago when we were talking about this issue, we were talking about a 40,000 childcare slot shortage in Greater Minnesota. And then COVID happened, and we've seen some great disruption in the childcare industry across the state and in particular in Greater Minnesota. Obviously, we'll see where things go with that as we move forward. But this is an issue that we know is important to our communities, it's important to our businesses, and it's important to our families. So I appreciate you all taking the time today to join us for this conversation. Our hope is that this will be an opportunity for you all to learn some more about what's really happening in the industry and what's happening on the ground across Minnesota. But more importantly, we want to make sure we answer your questions. So if you do have any questions throughout the next 40 minutes or so, please feel free to put those in the chat, and I'll work them into my conversation with Suzanne. So with that, I want to introduce Suzanne Pearl. Suzanne is the Minnesota Director for First Children's Finance, which is a great organization doing some incredible work throughout all of our communities. And so, rather than me trying to give you the true definition as to what First Children's Finance is, my first question to Suzanne is, Suzanne, can you tell us a little bit about what First Children's Finance is and the work you're doing in Greater Minnesota?
Hi, thanks, Scott, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to speak with you today. I am the Minnesota Director of First Children's Finance. First Children's Finance is a nonprofit organization based in Minnesota. We are in our 30th year of working on the business side of childcare in Minnesota. We also have programs in a few other states and do some national level systems work as well. We are also a CDFI, Community Development Financial Institution. All of a sudden I forgot what that meant, which means that we are also a lending organization. We are the only CDFI in the country whose entire lending portfolio is childcare businesses. This is, to quote somebody, this is all we do and we do it well. We, for the past maybe 5-6 years, have operated a program called the Rural Childcare Innovation Program. We operate in Greater Minnesota. Our staff are all based in Greater Minnesota. We have, we're pretty small. We only have 6 staff in Greater Minnesota, 1 in each of what we call the MIF regions of the state. And they are business development specialists or business development managers. And that means they work directly with individual childcare businesses and communities to increase the supply and financial sustainability of excellent childcare. We know that childcare is it's a tough business to be in. It's one with very small profit margin, if any potential for profit margin. And we work to help providers maximize their revenue to the best they can so they can stay in business to serve families and communities. Many of the providers in our state are women. Many of them did not get into childcare because they were excited about running a business with small margins. They were excited about caring for children and helping out their neighbors and their community. I'll speak just quickly about the Rural Childcare Innovation Program. This is it's an application process where communities come together, where they've recognized either at the city level or county level, however they define themselves, that they really need more childcare. And they work with us. It's a 2-year process where we bring together stakeholders, existing childcare providers, people in the early care and education area, community leaders, business leaders. Maybe there's an employer in town who's having trouble recruiting employees to their area. We've had local elected officials, legislators on these groups, and they come together and talk about, first of all, we measure the gap. So in this area, what is the childcare supply gap? And then we help the community come up with what we call right-sized solutions. Is the solution, is it more family childcare? Is it a center? Is it a combination of both? What are the strengths in the community? Is there some available space? Are there available facilities? Are there potential tax incentives that can be done locally to help stimulate the growth of these businesses? So it's over 2 years, we work together with these communities to help come up with a community solution action plan and then implement that plan. And hopefully at the other end, we've got an increase in available childcare for that local community. And I'm going to stop there and ask Scott if he has further questions.
That's great. And for any of the city folks who are interested in learning more about the program that Suzanne just talked about, feel free to shoot me an email and I can get you guys connected up with them for further discussions and send you the information on their website about the program. It really is a great program that has had a tremendous benefit for the communities that have participated in it. So thank you, Suzanne, and your colleagues for having that on as an option for us. So, one of the big game changers for us in Greater Minnesota in the conversation in the Capitol around the childcare crisis really came about with the work that you did, or First Homes Finance did, with the Center for Rural Policy and Development about 3 years ago when they released their childcare study that really highlighted this 40,000 childcare slot shortage that we have in Greater Minnesota. I know we can spend the entirety of this conversation on that issue alone, but can you give us a sense as to why we have this shortage? Why can't we get over the hump? What's happening in the marketplace and the industry that makes it so difficult to get childcare providers out there and financially sustainable?
Sure. It's a good question. It's an important question. There are a lot of reasons for it. The first one that I'll talk about is maybe the simplest one to get is that there is a real demographic shift with people who are childcare providers now, many who are women who are getting towards retirement age and who are leaving the sector. At the same time, we are not attracting new providers into the sector. And that's for a lot of reasons. Some of them are generational. There's this, a lot of talk about how, maybe millennials don't want to run a business in their house. They would prefer to run a program elsewhere. There are a lot of women who get into childcare for maybe just a space of a number of years while their own children require care, and then they phase out of it. So the demographic issue is one that's been coming for at least a decade. The state came out with some data that shows this pretty consistent decrease in childcare providers in Greater Minnesota. I would also say that focusing on childcare centers in Greater Minnesota, that's a much tougher business model. Centers work with, like I said, very thin margins with very high fixed costs. We say that for a childcare center, about 70% of their costs are staffing, maybe 20% are facilities, and that leaves only 10% to actually run a program and to maybe see some profit. So there's not a lot of movement, not a lot of levers to pull. And then when you talk about being in a rural area where the market from which you draw, it could be limited by how far people are able to drive, are willing to drive, what kind of employers are in town, what the general needs are. It's much tougher for a center in Greater Minnesota to have a more consistent enrollment, and enrollment means revenue, honestly, for us. The more kids you get in, the more money you're going to make. And I'll say another interesting thing about this, and this affects both family programs and childcare programs. It's nearly impossible for any childcare program to operate at 100% of capacity. So let's say you have a center with 57 childcare slots, and those are from different ages, or you're running a home family program with 10 available slots. There are regulations in place that govern how many staff you need per different age of child. So for infants, toddlers, preschool, school age. The thing is that all of the kids in your program, the 57 kids in your center, they don't all have the same birthday. So they don't all age across these rooms, these classrooms at the same time. So if you have in your toddler room a child who on, let's say, April 1st is going to age up into preschool, but you don't have an infant right away who's going to age into that toddler room until July, you've got 3-4 months there of that open space in your toddler room where you're not making money. But you're not going to, tell your family that, whoops, we're going to give away that space. So when your infant becomes a toddler, they won't be able to have that space in your center. So it's pretty complicated for childcare businesses to figure out how to maximize their enrollment, to even try to, cover their fixed expenses or even make a profit.
So this isn't an easy business to try and run.
No.
You've got regulations you have to deal with. You've
Mhm.
got a complex business model you need to figure out. And you have, a lot of situations in which, especially in the family care side, you have, a recent parent who has decided that, I've got a kid at home now. I'm going to step out of the workforce. So I'm going to have a childcare business out of the house for the next 5 or 7 years. When they make that decision, it's not just, oh, I can go open up a business and do this. There are lots of things they need to figure out.
Yeah.
And so, how do they go about figuring out how to make these things work?
Right. Well, there are a lot of resources. We run a startup boot camp for people who are interested in entering the childcare business. The Department of Human Services has a lot of listening sessions. County-based licensors are great resources. Local county licensors are fantastic at kind of helping people who are interested in entering the business find out the resources that they need. There are some financing options available that are specific to childcare. For example, our loan fund, the USDA has some financing available for childcare. But yeah, it can be really disorienting when you try to get into it, and all of a sudden you're faced with all of these kind of new things you need to be tracking.
So obviously in the past 10 months, all of our lives have been disrupted in a pretty significant way. And I know the pandemic has had a big impact on the childcare industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I do want to acknowledge the work that the states and the feds have done in pumping money into the childcare industry just to prop up providers as families have pulled out of the system, knowing that at some point they're going to come back into the system.
Mm-hmm.
And I do also want to acknowledge for those of us in Greater Minnesota, back in late March, early April, the Sixth Initiative Foundation stepped up in partnership with the state and others to do the initial round of emergency grants to providers. So to the 6 minutes, I know some of them are on the call here today. Thank you for that initial work. But Suzanne, what does the pandemic mean for us going forward? I know we've got this 40,000 childcare slot deficit pre-pandemic. What do we think things are going to look like in a year or 2 years out from now?
Well, one, if there is any silver lining here to a pandemic, which is a phrase that I can't believe I'm actually saying, is that I think there is a broader recognition of the importance of childcare to economic development and to the functioning of our overall economy. Childcare tends to get put into human services, social services. It's, families are struggling with it. But the point that I would like you all to take away, if there's anything that you can take away, is that everybody in the state of Minnesota benefits from a thriving childcare sector. Whether you have kids or not, whether you use childcare or not. Childcare is foundational to communities being able to attract businesses who then can put resources back into those communities. We all benefit from having childcare in place. So I agree with what you said, Scott. Minnesota was pretty responsive pretty quickly and did get some capital into the childcare sector, which largely has stabilized the sector. Minnesota has done better than most other states in how many programs we were able to retain and keep in business. And I think that's definitely been a good thing. But now we are looking at, hopefully we're looking at a light at the end of the tunnel, we think, where we're trying to get the economy back in, and we're in this strange period of, okay, what's next? And what I would say is, let's not go back to crisis level, because that's where we were. So where are the opportunities to make the system a little bit better? And again, I think that I'll call out just the infusion of capital into these businesses as they were able to weather the ups and downs in enrollment was really a critical piece here.
So we had a couple questions in here I'm going to get to, but one of them is dealing with this pandemic situation. And it was an acknowledgement that, these state grants that were going out to providers were critical.
Mm-hmm.
And I know the state has extended those through February. Is there a possibility to keep that money going? And, I think from my vantage point, most of the money that I believe is paid for these grants has been through the federal COVID funds. Mm-hmm. And so the state's kind of been a pass through. Yeah. But, Suzanne, how important have those dollars been? And, what do we think about money going forward?
I think it's possible. I don't know as much about this as others, but I believe that there is potential for another round of COVID relief. And I believe that both Republicans and Democrats have called out childcare in the packages that they're putting forward at the federal level. I have been in discussions along with many others and some others on this call, with Department of Human Services, the governor's children's cabinet, about how best to use that. And I think a survey went out directly to childcare providers as well about, their thoughts on moving forward. And I think childcare providers have been admirably vocal about their needs. And I think they have really, really engaged and advocated for themselves in a way that maybe they might not have done in previous years, that it really got so critical with the pandemic that they just needed help. And I will give the governor's office and the legislature a lot of credit for responding as they did.
So jumping back into our participants' questions here, and you kind of hinted on this in your previous answer, that childcare is bigger than just that relationship between the provider and the family that they're caring for. Childcare is critical for our economic health of our communities, our employers being able to have employees who can staff their businesses and whatnot. And frankly, that's where the coalition and the Greater Minnesota Partnership come into this conversation. We got involved in this issue because we were seeing challenges of our business community finding, hiring, keeping the employees they need to maintain their businesses, to keep their businesses in our communities. And so, acknowledging that childcare is bigger than just that transactional provider-family relationship, what can we do to start changing that conversation around the value and the importance of childcare in the bigger reality of community health?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important for a conversation like this to happen, where it's not just childcare stakeholders on the call. It's city leaders, community leaders, elected officials, employers. One of the things that we started to see in recent years, pre-pandemic, was this kind of cry from business owners saying, "Wait a minute, I've got this business here, and I cannot people are telling me they will not come to work for me because they can't find childcare near me. And it really is critical that people outside of the childcare arena make their voices heard. There are a number of potential ideas being kicked around at the legislature. And Scott, you'll know more than I will about support on workforce development. We talk about how staffing costs are so high, but at the same time, mostly women who work in these centers are not being paid very, very well. They could probably work at Target for less training and make more money, or at any, kind of local business at a better hourly wage that they might be making in a childcare center. So there are ideas on workforce support. Facilities is another. It's kind of a threshold issue. We work with a number of childcare providers who have maybe, for years run a family program out of their home, and they have more people wanting, their services than they can start, and they'd like to open up a center. But just the financing, the amount that it takes to finance a center, getting architectural renderings and getting a mortgage in place. So there, Scott, you may want to talk about your work on facilities here, because I think that's really important too.
Yeah, no, we'll jump into that in a minute here, but I wanted to segue into the conversation around the emerging pod model. And for those of you on the line, so in Minnesota, we have two separate licensing structures for providers in Minnesota. One is a family license. If you're having a childcare business in your home, you've got 8 or 10 kids you're caring for, or we have a childcare center license where you're dealing with 60 or 80 or 100 kids in a facility, and it's a much more rigorous licensing structure. But one of the things that's starting to have more conversation around is the pod model, where you bring in 4 or 5 family licenses to kind of operate together in some shared space, some separate defined space for that individual license. Suzanne, what's your take on the pod model, especially given Greater Minnesota, where it is really hard to have the economies of scale work for a childcare center and have 67 or 70 or 80 kids there, but maybe you can have 30 or 40 or 50 coming together under a pod situation.
Mm-hmm. We're big fans of the idea. And when I said earlier that, there's this trend of younger people not really wanting to run a business out of their home, that people really want a little more space between their work life and their personal life, that can be a really, a really good option that isn't as, doesn't encroach as much. And for a community that say, yeah, you're right, can't support 120 seat center, but if you've got maybe a facility where you can have 3 or 4 different family providers providing services, and then, as I also mentioned that there are many women who get into this while their own kids require care and then kind of stop. That means that when one of the providers leave, you don't lose the entire pod. You can bring another one in. There are some regulatory issues here that the Office of Inspector General is concerned with, as far as who's responsible for the shared spaces, and making sure that all of the kind of fire marshal requirements are being looked at, but we do think that it could really be an option to help in Greater Minnesota.
So First Wilderness Finance, obviously you're the Minnesota director
Mm-hmm.
for First Wilderness Finance, which means there are probably other states that you all are working in. Any lessons learned from what's happening in other places that we should be thinking about in Minnesota?
Yeah. So we run programs in Iowa and Michigan, and we have a national level program that works more on a systems level with states as they consider trying to improve their childcare system. Our chief program officer, Heidi Hagelbraid, who was the previous Minnesota director and is now my boss, she has been in touch with 10 to 12 other states, at least since the start of the pandemic. There is really kind of a critical mass across the country to try to address childcare shortages and the pre-existing childcare crisis. We are getting a lot of interest in our loan fund and in this idea that Minnesota did about just infusing capital. We're talking about forgivable loans for childcare providers. We're talking about low interest loans, zero interest loans, just to kind of take off the ease of some of the financing options. But again, I'll say that Minnesota is doing much better than many other states.
So adjusting the conversation here a little bit into, the work that we all do from the coalition and the partnership standpoint. Our focus is how do we get things done at the Capitol to have an impact on what's happening in Greater Minnesota. Obviously, our goal is to shrink that 40,000 childcare slot shortage that we have, to stabilize the industry, to make sure that our employers have what they need from a workforce to thrive and be successful. As I talk with folks at the Capitol, it's not always this case, but generally I hear from Republicans that the childcare issue is driven by regulations. As I talk to Democrats, I generally hear that that the childcare crisis is driven by lack of funding. Acknowledging that in Greater Minnesota we have a higher concentration of Republican representation within our cities in our region, knowing that I'm hoping that all of the folks on this line will at some point contact their legislator and have these conversations with them about the importance of doing something on the childcare crisis. So if one side's saying it's regulations, one side's saying it's funding, is one of them right? Is one of them wrong? Are they both right? Are they both wrong? Kind of what's the nexus that we need to be dealing with here?
Really it's a little bit of both. There is no doubt that childcare is a highly regulated industry. And when you're dealing with our most vulnerable tiny Minnesotans, you can see that, but there are a lot of regulations, that is for sure. And it's a very underfunded sector. That's also clear. So I would say that it's a bit of both, and neither side is right or wrong here. I think in 2019, you might know this more than I, the legislature put together speaking about family childcare, a family childcare task force that just completed its work and will be releasing a report pretty quickly here, if not already, that forwarded a number of recommendations in this area that might be an interesting thing for people to look at as they're thinking about this.
Yes, we are waiting with bated breath for that report to come out, and we'll be pushing it out there, and we'll be thinking about our legislative agenda in the context of that to see how we can support some of those key reforms going forward. So I do have a question that came in that kind of segues into my next part of this conversation. So we can hit on this a little bit, but I think Susanna it might also dovetail into the conversation about some of the D grants, the MIF grants, and some of those things going forward. But one of the concerns that we hear from local providers is the annual training that they have to do. And just the geographic reality that we have in Greater Minnesota, where it's a huge geographic area, and that training isn't always readily available or convenient, especially for providers who are working a lot of hours on Monday through Friday and can't always get away easily to get the training done. So if you can just comment a little bit about that, and then we'll come back to that as we talk about the policy ideas.
Well, the good news is that this is an area where people on this call could actually help. They might actually be able to help. I mentioned our Rural Childcare Innovation Program. In one community a few years ago, we hold a town hall where everybody comes and we kind of educate the larger community about childcare. And there were a number of providers who said this exact thing, that I need to have CPR training, for example. And I have, I can't leave. I can't take it during the day because I've got parents dropping off at 6 o'clock and maybe not picking up until 6:30 at night. When can I go get this? If I have to take a day off, I lose an entire day of revenue and I disrupt all of these families. And at that town hall was the CEO of a local medical clinic. And he said, we do this training every quarter. Why don't we offer this training after hours at no cost to licensed childcare providers? And that was one of the right size solutions that this community came up with. So I would encourage everybody on this call to think creatively about what assets you have locally and then reach out to local providers to help come up with some ideas.
Perfect. So we're going to segue here into a minute or so conversation on kind of what the coalition and the partnership are up to this session, some of the bills we're working on, and then we'll come back and talk some more with Suzanne about kind of how these things are going to impact on the ground if we can get the funding and the support for them. So hopefully if I share my screen here that this will in fact come through okay. All right, hopefully this is showing up for everybody okay. So there are kind of four things that we're working on heavily this year. One is the continuation of the emergency grants that have supported the childcare industry over the course of the pandemic. We've had these in place monthly since April, and they have really just kind of supported the providers and kind of got them through the rough waters of the pandemic. As we indicated earlier, the grants right now end in February, but there is still more money that the state has access to from the federal COVID bill from December that we could continue those grants under current funding, I think, into April or May. And so we're really hoping that we can do that just because we know families aren't getting their kids back into childcare at the same rate. And so this should just help the providers get a little bit farther down the pandemic line as things go forward. The second thing we're working on is funding for the Minnesota Initiative Foundations. The MIFs have been doing work for a number of years in childcare, and this funding would allow them to just continue doing that work, to ramp up their work. We're asking for $4 million to be split between the 6 initiative foundations for them to do the things they've been doing, from training to business consulting to technical assistance for providers to community engagement, to try and figure out what these solutions are. And we've been fortunate, frankly, over the years that the Initiative Foundations and First Children's Finance have worked very closely on a lot of these efforts. And so the things that you're hearing Suzanne talk about over the course of this webinar are things that we're hoping these dollars can help bring into more of our communities going forward. The third thing, I guess, is our facilities grant program. Last year in the bonding bill, when that passed in October, we were successful in creating a new program at the Department of Employment and Economic Development that's the Greater Minnesota Child Care Facilities Grant Program. And this would provide capital to local governments or providers, depending on which of the sides of the grant they use, to provide some of that capital money that they're looking for. One of the things that we run into is with childcare businesses not generally being a high profit or profitable at all industry, it's really hard for childcare providers to access capital in the private sector to build out capacity, to provide new space or whatnot. So this is a program, it would be funded with $10 million in bonds and $10 million in cash. So on the bonded side, those dollars would be available to cities, counties, and school districts to purchase, build, rehab space that could then be made available to childcare providers. So a couple of quick examples under this is that if you have a vacant storefront on Main Street, if a Pizza Hut has closed down or whatnot, and you have a vacant building, the city could buy that property, convert it into a childcare facility, and then lease it out to the providers. And this is, in my opinion, where the pod model comes into play. If it's a big enough space, you could bring in 3 or 4 or 5 licensed family care providers to come in and operate a pod where you have 40 or 50 kids being served in that setting. On the cash side, since it is cash, those grants would be available to providers themselves to come in and do that same kind of development. And so we think, providing the capital will help to bend that cost curve so that hopefully the businesses can become more profitable or profitable to begin with, and kind of reduce that cost side of the equation. And then the third thing is a renewal of the deed grants. And these are similar to the Initiative Foundation grants. These are ones that are funded through deed, that are available to any applicant across the state. We've had situations in the past where YMCAs have gotten them to expand capacity. The MIFs have gotten them in the past. We've just seen some really innovative community solutions on these dollars. And what we realized both with the Initiative Foundation grants and the deed grants is when some of the state money comes in, the local money follows it. And so, what may be a $50,000 grant from the state becomes a $500,000 total project because local businesses and others step forward and start, leveraging those dollars against each other. So these are the things we're working on this year. We just had a hearing yesterday on the Initiative Foundation's grant proposal in the House. And so, hopefully we see these things going forward. But as we think about these things, Suzanne, let's first talk about the facilities aspect. Mm-hmm. What can we realistically see happen in Greater Minnesota if we can get, substantial investment and new capital coming into our communities?
What could we see if we get that?
Yeah.
A much more stable childcare sector, I think. Right now it's really a little bit scattershot across the state. The childcare sector is being hit. I mean, as is everybody. This is a very asymmetric pandemic. The economic impact is different depending on what area, what region, what industry. And I think that could provide a more targeted way to support the childcare sector in areas where the economy is not quite back yet, or maybe never was as strong to support the creation of childcare slots.
And there was a question, and it was answered in the chat. So that program, that capital program, was created, but it wasn't funded in the bonding bill. And so we're hoping this year, if there is a bonding bill, that we have some money in there, and there could be cash either from the Jobs and Economic Development Committees, or there could be cash included in the bonding bill if that happens. So one of the things I would encourage all of you to do as you talk with your local legislators is encourage them to do a bonding bill this year. We have things we need to get done, especially in Greater Minnesota, and a bonding bill is a great way to do that. So Suzanne, thanks for the comments on, kind of the potential if we can get the capital coming into Greater Minnesota.
Can I say one more thing? I just want to say your point about financing being leveraged into other financing is critical here.
Absolutely. And that's one of the big benefits of when we can do things on the ground. Our community step forward. Our business community knows that the childcare is critical for their self-interest. Our local government leaders know the same. And so when we can leverage, the state resources and local resources, some really cool things can happen. Mm-hmm. So then looking at the Initiative Foundations and the deed grants, that's looking more at how do we get money in there to support providers themselves, either through access to training, access to technical assistance to figure out how you set up that business, access to participation in programs like Parent Aware. Just from your experience working in Greater Minnesota, partnering with the MIFs and whatnot, can you talk a little bit about just what the real impact is on the ground when these kind of dollars come into our communities?
Yep, we partner with a number of the Initiative Foundations, and we've had long-standing, strong partnerships here, and it's allowed us to supplement our work in communities specific to these Initiative Foundations. So there's a lot of local effort, local knowledge that goes in here, and as I mentioned earlier, our staff are local to these areas as well. We are currently working we're partnering with the Southwest Initiative Foundation in Worthington right now to do a study and plan for for childcare, but also with a focus on culturally and linguistically relevant care, focusing on more diverse populations in and around Worthington, and how to ensure there's enough licensed care for that everyone can access. We have a few projects to expand our training. One of the things that we did when the pandemic hit was we quadrupled the amount of business focused trainings that we had provided the year prior. And we've had funding from several of the initiative foundations in support of that effort. And another silver lining in this pandemic is we have been able to offer web-based training. So providers don't have to, again, get out of their house, drive wherever they need to go, but they can access accredited training, which they need to do anyway to keep their license, but access that from home at a time that works for them. A lot of these are, evening trainings. And that's something that's actually a lesson learned from the pandemic, that we're going to shift our model a little bit in how we deliver trainings. And we're continuing to speak to our MIF partners about being able to continue that.
So we just have a couple minutes left here. So for our participants, if you have a last burning question, please sort in the chat now if you want to have a chance to hear Suzanne's response to it. I think, Suzanne, one of the things I appreciate about the work that's happening in Greater Minnesota is, the acknowledgement that different communities have different needs. What we see in northern Minnesota may not be what we see in southern Minnesota, but at the same time, what we learn in Owatonna may be applicable to what's happening in Alexandria. And so, just any advice to our city leaders here about, how they may want to think or how they may want to respond to addressing this issue as a community leader, and where they can go from here.
Yeah. I would say reach out to your local provider community. I saw a quick comment that came up in the chat about, focusing on creating new slots, but what about existing slots? And a lot of existing providers are eager to expand as they can, so it's not about bringing in new businesses and kind of setting aside what's already existing in a community. It's about a full community-based effort to expand it for everyone. I think reaching out through either your local licensing office or any local early childhood stakeholders would be a great place to start, because providers want to talk to you. They want to tell you about what they're experiencing, and they would love to engage on finding some solutions.
So as we're closing out here, I just want to encourage all of our city folks around here that if you don't already have conversations going on with your providers, as Suzanne indicated, if you don't have conversations or connections in with the Initiative Foundation serving your region, I think the best first step is to make those introductions, because they can, at a minimum, they can help you think through like what the challenges are and what the options are. But more importantly, they can start to build that collaboration and things to going forward. Secondly, if any of you have questions about the rural initiative that Suzanne talked about in her intro, shoot us an email. We'd be happy to connect you with Suzanne or her colleagues at First Children's Finance, because it really is a powerful effort going forward. And then thirdly, the last thing that I would encourage you all to do is to reach out to your legislators. Have this conversation, make them realize that we've got to do something about the childcare crisis. To be honest, I would say let's do anything, but hopefully we can be more targeted than that. But we can't just sit there and not acknowledge the realities of this, the shortage and this crisis on our communities, on our businesses, on the health and vitality and prosperity of Greater Minnesota. This is a big issue for our communities, and it's one that we need to address. So with that, Suzanne, do you have any last closing comments you want to leave our folks with?
No, I will say that our Rural Childcare Innovation Program, if you're interested, we have a website at www.ruralchildcare.org, and if you're interested in looking for more details.
And on that website, you can pull out the individual reports, and you can see the numbers as to what they've calculated your shortage for your individual city on that. it's a powerful report. It's one that I use frequently. It's depressing at times to kind of see, how hard some of our communities are being hit by the shortage. But the reality is most all of our cities do have a deficit in their childcare capacities. So with that, Suzanne, I want to thank you for taking the
Thank
time
you
with
so
us
much.
today. We really appreciate it. For all of our participants, thank you not only for participating today, but for all the work that you are doing out in our communities, for caring about this issue. We're all better when we can work together on these issues. If you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to contact any of us at the coalition. Or if you're looking for how to get connected with folks, we're happy to do what we can to help you, because we know this is a critical issue and one that needs to be addressed. So thank you for taking the time today, and thank you for all that you do in our communities.